Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm happy to be co-hosting this. Jessica's, as always, keeping us all on track and organizing everything. Thanks, Jessica, for all your hard work. I know she has to leave shortly, but she will be with us for a while and then she will leave it with me and Russell. And very, very happy to have Russell here to learn about podcasting, something I know very little about. So I'm going to be learning a lot, I hope, this afternoon. Just in case there's anybody new to IACD, if you need to know who we are the International Association for Community Development, which is a global multidisciplinary network of people who are all as passionate about community development as myself and the rest of you. And we have a global membership that extends into more than 70 countries. And we were just talking earlier about how wonderful it is to be part of such a global network and such a family. We are accredited with United Nations and we've got consultative status with the Economic and Social Council. Jessica will put into the chat just now the link for our conference coming up in Glasgow, which we're very excited about. And there are still a few more days left where you can benefit from the early bird special if you haven't yet registered up until the 16th of March. So yes, there it is in the chat, and I'll share it again later for others who still join us. So we are delighted to have Russell with us from Wales and excited to learn about podcasting. So I will hand over to him. And in the meantime, while he's chatting, if you have any questions and things, feel free to either raise a hand with the raise hand at the bottom, or you can put your chat question into the chat and I will make sure that Russell gets to it. So thank you, Russell. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Janine, and thank you, Jessica, as well. Good afternoon, Pranam Da. I'm really grateful and humbled actually that you wish to spend up to a couple of hours of your valuable time in my company. We're going to rattle through quite a little bit today, and I make no apologies for starting pretty much at the very, very beginning in terms of podcast media. People come at this sort of stuff from maybe different directions. They come at it at different times. And I think the best place to start is always kind of at the beginning. So if there's some of this stuff that you're already quite familiar with, be patient. I'm sure and I'm confident it'll be something that'll push your buttons before too long. Let's hopefully we tested this before. Now this is always the panicky bit when you got to click that first slide, and hopefully it'll change. There we go. Brazen sales pitch now. Myself, Alan Twelvetrees may be known to you. Alan lives a little bit further to the west in South Wales from where I am in Cardiff, lives down in Swansea, and him and I published a book, the 6th edition of his book that came back out when I was, I think, literally in short trousers. Alan's in his 80s now and brought me on board just to kind of help him get certainly the final edition for him anyway, over the line. And Policy Press at Bristol University have been kind enough to offer everybody here, everyone who signed up, a discount on that book. So that slide will be back up again at the end. So just a little bit about me. Been involved in community development, community work since 2002. Fell into it, was no grand plan on my part. And I've been involved in all sorts of different aspects, from sort of estates and neighbourhood work, area coordination. Spent a lot of time workforce development on the Communities First programme in Wales, which some people might be familiar with. Ran for a number of years up till 2018, and most of that time has been spent in the South Wales coalfields, in the valleys of South Wales. But I've worked elsewhere as well. Since 2018, when that program finished, and where I was doing a lot of workforce development and training kind of related stuff, I started working in an independent freelance capacity, and touch wood, that's kept me busy sort of ever since, and on a range of different things. And I usually just describe it as anything that's got that C word in there, that C word of community in there somewhere, then I'm perhaps not too far away from it. Tend to primarily work in Wales, but can be found elsewhere as well. I was an early adopter of podcast media, probably in about late 2000s, 2009, 10, something like that. And was really interested in it as a medium for learning, for sort of continuing professional development, workforce development. certainly its value in kind of reaching people kind of in this sort of medium, I suppose, which has become a little bit second nature since COVID and the pandemic, but that ability to connect and reach with people, on the other side of the world if necessary. And just kind of went into producing podcasts for other people, and doing some capacity building, which is kind of where I'm coming from with this. So that's a little bit about me. Some of my recent work involved with the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales. We've been doing some work in communities around climate change and how you engage communities on or about discussions to do with climate change. So obviously a really important piece of work, and the idea being that people can take sort of action and get involved, but have some influence as well, and how they might be able to know that they're influencing some of the decisions that get made around infrastructure, long-term but quite expensive decisions. It's been really, really fascinating. I'll pop some of these links in the chat. But also loved getting involved with the heritage and co-curating. We talk about co-curating quite a lot, perhaps. Splot is a working class steelworks or former steelworks community in Cardiff, and we worked with the community there to curate, their pocket museum. So it's a deck of cards they carry around with them, and they use it to tell people a story about this community, and very much develop some new narratives to very much go beyond the poverty, the disadvantage, the deindustrialization, but very much talks about how the community is at the vanguard of some of that renewal, that community-led renewal, which was great. And a social enterprise I'm involved with called Grow Social Capital has just launched this last couple of days, a campaign exploring English identity. So it's not something I'm particularly expert on, but it's my colleague Andy is launched that. It was in the Guardian on the weekend as well, and it's very much around trying to build more inclusive discussions around things to do with identity, belonging, rather than the sorts of flags on lampposts and the rather jingoistic ways in which these things can potentially get done. So that's a little bit about me, and in terms of podcasts, if anybody knows me, it's through producing some of the IACD's podcast output, but it's also the Community Development Podcast, which I founded in I think it was 2017, and I also do one about the Welsh football team, because as a middle-aged guy, if you're not doing a podcast about football, then you're not doing middle-aged correctly. And I've been doing that for coming up to 12 years. So like I said, an early adopter of listening and consuming media, but then fairly early in terms of getting involved as well, and developing it myself. Available on most leading platforms, and a few of the more niche ones as well. We'll be touching on some of the stuff around platforms and hosting and all that kind of stuff in due course. So apologies for a little bit of jargon that might have crept in there. A little bit of housekeeping and some etiquette. If you could sort of remain on mute, just to kind of limit the background noise that might come in. Happy to take questions though, if you kind of put your hand up. I think the technology sort of brings that to my attention. I've got another screen over here that I'm looking at as well. Please use the chat, share some observations, share some links, resources, put some podcasts that you listen to, whether they're work related or whether they're to do with your favourite breed of dog or your football team or films or whatever else it might be. It's a very rich kind of media out there. It's huge as well, and navigating it, I think, can be a bit daunting for some people who are new to the media. So if you want to drop some links into there, please do. It's very, very rare I leave this sort of setting without having picked up another little podcast that I can get stuck into as well. And please interact with one another as well. I do quite like a lively sort of chat panel in these sorts of things. In terms of putting up your hand, I'm happy to take some questions, but there will be some points and natural kind of junctions at which we can specifically take some questions and recap on some of the stuff that's been covered. So feel free to sort of sit on it as well. There are no super questions. As I said, some people come at this media maybe arriving at it very, very recently. Others are a little bit more longer in the tooth with it, such as myself. It's not a problem at all, like I said, so there are no stupid questions. I'd rather people ask them rather than just sit on them. Remember, this is being recorded, so just sort of bearing that in mind in terms of anything you say or pop in the chat. And we will be taking at least one break, maybe two, depending on pace and progress throughout the next couple of hours. I will leave Jessica to post in the chat where this will be available afterwards, or whether it'll be sent out specifically just to the people who've expressed an interest in this and not were not able to make it. Some other podcasts I produce, like I said, there is the IACD one, which if you haven't yet listened to, you haven't found, there's not a huge amount of content on there. That is something we are looking to change, obviously. But that's at SoundCloud. It's hosted on SoundCloud. Like I said, it's available on lots of other platforms. But at soundcloud.com, IACD_global. And these are a few of the organisations. They're across a range of different sectors. So there's private sector, there's the voluntary community sector, there's large universities. That I produce some content for, and there's a few others there as well. But you'll see very much things around, community projects, voluntary organisations, people getting out there and wanting to use this media as a way of communicating what they want to say to people, rather than maybe going through a filter or an editorial control or process that maybe traditional, in inverted commas, media tend to apply. So that sense of maybe giving people a little bit more control around the messaging that they get out and the voices that get heard, and we'll be revisiting some of that in the next few hours. So yeah, ICD podcast. Here's a little bit of a flavour of that. We did a series a while back off the back of the International Standards book that came out in I want to say 2022. Correct me please, Janine or Jessica if I'm wrong, but I think it was then. We did a chapter with a couple of contributors on each of those chapters to give a flavour of what was in that book. And I think that was pretty much the first toe dipped into the media that the IACD has done. Members of staff and people involved have maybe been on podcasts, have talked about community development, maybe on sort of standalone episodes of other podcasts, but in terms of the ICD itself, and it's very much its own kind of planned and thought through and very much branded, as you can see, content. This was the first effort, and there's been a few other episodes coming out since then, and there's going to be a short series coming out week commencing the 21st of March to mark a couple of the international week and a couple of the international days around expressing solidarity with peoples experiencing racism, racial discrimination, victims of the slave trade, and so on. And I think there's going to be a little bit more publicity coming out about that. We're just putting the finishing touches on those episodes as we speak. So, what are we covering today? We are covering some terminology, breaking some of that down, getting a little bit comfortable and familiar with what some of this means. We're going to look at some of the reasons why people start a podcast. Lots of people start podcasts. There's an awful lot of people that never really go very far with them. They get a bit bogged down with it. They find it a bit labour intensive. They find it a bit of a slog. So reasons for starting and reasons for continuing might not necessarily be the same thing, but we're going to explore some of that, certainly in relation to some of your work, your practice, but also just maybe another interests and passions that you have. We'll look at hosting and syndication, so a little bit of terminology there, a bit of jargon. We'll be breaking that down. About finding your voice. What is it that you want to say? Yeah, and who do you want to say it to? I think this is really, really important. I often start with this sort of stuff rather than going straight into the technology, the microphones, the recording, the editing software, etc. I find that if we can map out and explore and really critique and interrogate some of this sort of stuff, actually the technological stuff is relatively straightforward to get your head around, and actually you just learn through doing by and large, and making some mistakes and learning from those. This is the sort of stuff that's maybe a little bit richer. It's a little bit more reflective. I find that a better podcast people can put together and launch, having gone through these steps. So we touch very, very basically on some of the issues around equipment and technology towards the end. I don't really use the term audience when coming to podcasts, certainly in a context with this sort of audience and the sort of workforce that I tend to come into contact with. I much prefer the word community, but why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't we? But also that sense of a listenership as well. So as I said, we'll be coming back to that in a bit. I'm obliged really to talk about ethics. I think obviously that's really, really important around the voices that we or the guests and the voices that we bring onto any podcast that we start, the platform that we're giving them. We're very privileged in how we edit the process, what stays in the recording, what gets left out. So there's very much an ethical dimension that I think we're obliged to kind of spend some time looking at. Like I said, we touch on the equipment. And we'll touch on, but we're not going to cover any recording. We're not going to be recording anything today for the purposes of the podcast. We will, however, touch on the fact that some of you are in very, very vast countries, covering very, very vast territories and jurisdictions. And obviously recording over the internet is something that is much more feasible now in terms of podcasts than it ever was when I started. Indeed, I probably spend 80 to 90% of my time producing podcasts, whether it's for myself or for others, here, not leaving this desk, rather than doing it face to face. So I'll be touching on some of that, and I'll be introducing a software called Audacity, a free piece of software that's available to download at any time you want to, in which I do all of my editing, and you can do some recording in it. I touch on it, but we don't go into any detail really with those. It's not really necessarily the time for that. So that's what we are covering. What we're not covering, like I said, we're not doing any recording. We'll not be doing any editing. I'm not covering either, and sometimes this does get asked, I'm not covering the aspects of monetization or commercializing podcasts. I think there's a time and a place to cover that. It's not something I'm particularly interested in either, or expert in for that matter. There's plenty of people out there who can talk about that sort of stuff, but we're not covering sort of that sort of stuff. We will be touching on, and perhaps running as a thread through all of this is, well, how much does this cost? You know, is it an expensive medium? Is it an expensive technology to get involved in? Clearly there's a time commitment that can translate into cost for those people coming at this in a professional capacity, perhaps in a work capacity. That's about the only issue of sort of finance or commerce that we'll be touching on today. Hopefully that is what you were expecting. I'm kind of interested though in terms of yourselves. I know a little bit about where you're based. And you've given me a flavour. I can see some of the podcasts that you listen to. I'd be interested, and I'm in Jessica's hands as to how this poll works and where you can access it. But I'd be interested to know how often you listen to podcasts of any type and in any context.
Is that showing up on the screen, Russell?
I can see it. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, good.
Okay. That's quite a spread actually. It's more variation that I tend to encounter on these sorts of things. All of which is fine, none of which is a problem. As I said, for those of you who are regular listeners, again, please make some recommendations, drop them in the chat. I can see Harley has. Those are ones none of which I'm familiar with, so I'll be investigating those. If there's any that you have stumbled across, please let people know that you value their taste, and thank you for sharing them. Okay, perhaps pop in the chat. This wouldn't really work in a poll. Which platforms do you use? What are you listening to your podcast on? I'm always curious, not least because the technology drives behaviours with a lot of this sort of stuff, and this is something that we'll come back to and we'll touch on a little bit more in a bit more detail later on. But if you can just drop that in the chat where you listen to them, what sort of platforms. So, but yeah, there's also the devices that you're listening to as well. Apple Podcast. So I use Podbean. I'll just drop that in there. I used to really love Google Podcasts, and then Google decided to close that down to kind of migrate it over, integrate it with YouTube, and just wasn't my cup of tea. So I was looking for something else. I'm not an Apple user, and so I thought, well, I'll give Podbean a chance, and I've kind of stuck with it. One tends to find in a lot of the research around this sort of stuff that there's an inertia. It's a bit like bank accounts. Once you start with one, you stay with it for life almost, and it's very rare that people necessarily go flip back and forth between different platforms. A lot of people saying Spotify, which is really interesting because Spotify was a relative late adopter to taking podcasts or carrying podcasts, and in the course of taking podcasts on and making those available has actually, and is a really good example of how the technology drives behaviours, has actually really put a bit of a rocket beneath and behind younger people engaged with podcast media. Until Spotify did, I'm generalising a little bit, but there's a lot in this, it was seen as a slightly older person's, and when I say that, I mean sort of 30s to 40s, not so much the older end of the scale. And we come back, we touch on some of the interesting kind of demographic data in all of this in due course. Spotify really brought podcasts onto the radar of younger people, and certainly under 25 and teens. And so that has driven a lot of the behaviour. That then drives a lot of the content. It drives a lot of the ways in which podcasts are being designed and how they're advertised, and certainly then some of the monetization and the commercial aspects of it as well. So I find that stuff sort of fascinating. It's not necessarily everybody's cup of tea, but it shows there's that kind of sort of reflexivity. Behaviours drive technology, but technology drives behaviours as well. And I think it's something always to remain alert to when looking to maybe get your own podcast off the ground, because it's a very intimate medium. I'm sure that of those podcasts people are listening in the chat, you have probably got to know the hosts of those podcasts really quite well, and beyond just the themes and the topics of the podcast that they discuss. You probably know the hosts are, married, or that they the breed of dog, or which football team they support, or whatever else it might be, because it's that relatively intimate experience. If I was buying a new LP or something, I might invite my friends around to give it a listen as I take it out of the packet. I don't think I've ever invited anybody to come and listen to a podcast with me. It's a very intimate thing. We tend to listen with our headphones. People relate, they engage with the content in a far different way to a lot of other media. So I find some of that sort of stuff fascinating. I can see. I noticed Laurie Laurie Cook joined the call. Yeah, Laurie's got a podcast that I've only just stumbled across in the last couple of months as well. So yeah, definitely a growing medium and technology. So what is a podcast? It's simply a digital file made available on the internet for downloading to a PC or some sort of portable media player, an MP3 player. If anybody has MP3 players anymore, iPods back in the day, it's usually just on a smart mobile phone. But it can also be played on a Bluetooth speaker, all those sorts of digital media technologies, and that all it is. It's an audio file. Yes, YouTube has begun to really fuel the visual podcast, watching people talk. It's not something I particularly do. I like to listen to my podcast when I'm out and about, and it just requires the one sense of hearing rather than sort of watching. I also have a face for just an audio only medium, so nobody needs to see me recording and talking. But I fully appreciate that is of interest to some people, and that's absolutely fine. So yeah, a digital audio file. And the sort of the etymology, is that the word? From iPod, so that Apple technology, and iTunes, if you remember iTunes, very much kind of drove the early availability of podcasts, sort of in that kind of mid 2000s onwards. And cast is from broadcast. That's essentially the term. Although there's an interesting other kind of origin story, which I'll share with you in a moment, as to where this, as in terms of the origins of the term. Typically available as a series. But you tend to find sort of one-off recordings. The internet is littered with them, frankly, or short series. Maybe I don't know, a series of 5 or 6. There's a couple of podcasts related to community development out there that perhaps are reflecting the challenges of the work that we undertake, that kind of existed for the duration maybe of a particular program or a particular project. And I always get a sense that maybe once the funding ended, so did the podcast. Maybe it did what it wanted to do in a short period of time, and there's a lot to be said for that. But you'll get short series, but typically these are episodes that go on and on and on and on and on. So my community development podcast has just gone through the 50th episode milestone. My football one is approaching its 200th episode in 12 years, just over 12 years. So it gives you an idea of how frequently we record. You can subscribe, and that's the key thing in terms of this thing around the technology and the behaviour driving one and then reflexively driving the other. you can subscribe so that new episodes find you. You're not having to, look through a radio or a TV guide to look at, oh, it's on at 7 o'clock and it'll be on this Radio 2 or on that kind of public channel, a public station or whatever it might be. It finds you. You wake up, as I did this morning, and I'm told that I get a new episode of a true crime, because I do quite like a bit of true crime. Episode of a true crime podcast I listen to has dropped today. Yeah, so that ability for the podcast to find you, I think, has really helped carve help the technology carve out its niche. And in a recent survey, and I touch on a few surveys and stats in a moment. In a recent survey, 83% of respondents cited the convenience of podcasts as one of the main things that appeals to them. Yeah. So I think that's really something to bear in mind. Yeah. You may have a small team in your organisation, heavily reliant on volunteers. You may not have a huge amount of resource in terms of communications and things like that. Once that podcast has been found by somebody, once they have subscribed, it will keep finding them, and that does a huge amount of heavy lifting for you in terms of getting your messaging out to people, whatever that messaging may be. We'll touch on that in a moment. So yeah, I'll drop this little link in the chat. It's a fascinating origin story. This guy's Ben Hammersley. He's a technology journalist with for a long time with The Guardian. I must confess, I'm not sure if he still is with The Guardian. A very strong facial hair game, as I'm sure you'll agree. And this is a short excerpt from an article from quite a few years ago. Now that's that link in the chat. He had just filed a piece on internet radio blogs. That's a catchy term. And had that last minute call from the subs desk, from the editorial team. We need one more sentence just to fill the page. So I wrote something pompous like, and what should we call this new phenomenon? Audio blogs? How about podcasts? So we could have been talking here about an introduction to audio blogging. Maybe in a parallel universe, that's what we are doing. Instead, we are talking about podcasts. And it was literally iPod, broadcast, that'll do, chuck together. Close to midnight, he signs off, and the rest is history. And as I said, there's a little bit more detail in that link there. Some stats for you, just to give a sense of like the global kind of reach and scale of these things. Apologies if these are a little bit global north in focus and a little bit anglophonic as well. Apologies for that. Data for other parts of the globe is far harder to find and certainly harder for me to translate. But just to give you a flavour, in the UK, about 1 in 4 people, 23%, listen to podcasts fairly regularly, defined as at least once a month. Okay, so those who are maybe displaying or sharing some of the behaviours of those of us who listen daily and weekly, it's a lot less than that, but it's still a sizable number, have some sort of awareness of and engagement with the media. Different jurisdictions, different countries carry out the media in different ways. These are all 2025 in the main data. In the USA, over half of adults listen to podcasts, again, fairly regularly. In Australia, I think we've got a couple of people from Australia there today. You're talking 52% of people aged 15 and over are listening to podcasts. Here's one for you, Janine. I knew you were joining us. South Africa, bit hard to penetrate this data. 4.9% of the population, so a lot smaller. Maybe that reflects access to infrastructure, the broadband technology and things like that. But what was really interesting was that 2 in 3 of the people who listen to podcasts are 18 to 34. Yeah, and I do wonder the extent to which Spotify has driven some of that behaviour, in terms of making it available and the ubiquitousness of Spotify, and the fact that podcasts, very, very simply, are alongside, Taylor Swift streaming or whoever else it is that people are listening to. Canada, I think we saw somebody from, yes, we did, someone from Canada, minus 22 degrees, 36% of adults, 1 in 3. So, there's a couple of different ways you can look at these statistics. Is that there's already a lot of people being reached. It's very crowded. There's lots and lots of podcasts out there. There are gazillions of individual episodes. It's very crowded. How could my little podcast ever cut through and find an audience when it is so crowded? I think that's a perfectly valid thing to think. At the same time, let's not assume either that everybody else is listening to podcasts and it may be just not me. There is still quite a lot of growth in this. There are a lot of people out there who aren't, and that might be for a range of different reasons, not least to do with technology, access to data, and broadband infrastructure, smartphones, etc., etc. Absolutely fully recognise that. We don't go into some of the more structural reasons behind some of this. That kind of digital and broadband sort of disadvantage that some people experience is for another time. I fully appreciate and recognise that it's there. France has some high penetration rates as well in podcasts as well, which I thought was interesting, and obviously mainly in the French language. This is an interesting one in terms of like the overall sort of growth is, and it's mainly the little circles between the columns, is that you're looking at about a 6 to 7% growth year on year. Even now that the technology is fairly mature, a lot of the innovations that were taking place sort of 10 to 15 years ago or more, those have tended to be kind of, they've happened. There are mainstream technologies, fairly mainstream behaviours. It's quite a mature technology, but even so, there's still a growth year on year. This is a really interesting stat. So I've got something else here as well. There are, according to Apple, 4.5 million registered podcasts on its system. Only about 15% are active, and that equates to about 4.5 million podcasts, of which Apple carries 2.9 million, of which 15% are active. So about 440,000 podcasts are currently active. So there's an awful lot out there that have started and fizzled out for whatever reason. And what is defined as active? A podcast is defined as something that has at least 3 episodes with at least one of those episodes 3 minutes long. Yeah. So like I said, there's a lot of diversity in what we actually call a podcast as well. And I think some of that stuff is really, really interesting. This slide I like. Again, this is for just the USA. I think it's broadly similar of other similar countries in terms of sort of socioeconomically, and it's that 4th line from the top, that sort of slightly green line that's accelerating a little bit higher. That is that 50 to 64, so an older cohort getting on board in the States over the last couple of years at a slightly higher rate, which I think is interesting. But again, that's just for the USA. And it's just about listening to podcasts in the past 12 months. If we were looking at radio listenership and traditional, in inverted commas, radio listenership, it still remains quite stubbornly quite high amongst that age cohort. So like I said, there's always other things taking place here with some of these statistics, but they just can maybe hopefully give you a little bit of an insight into things. Where are the growing regions? This might be of appeal. This isn't something I've particularly explored or researched or investigated in any great detail, but I just thought, given we have potentially a global audience today here on this call, but also in terms of IACD's global international reach, here's some statistics for you as well. North America has the highest penetration rate globally in terms of podcast media. Europe has some quite wide variations that is disguised in this map within Western Europe. So like I said, France is quite high. It means it has the largest share of internet users. The largest share of its internet users are podcast listeners in North America, but it's Latin America and China where there is projections for the higher rates of growth in terms of podcast listenership, which is not necessarily the same as podcast production, though there is clearly an overlap. I might be living in Western Europe, according to this map, and listening to podcasts from North America, which I do quite a lot, and vice versa, and in other jurisdictions and other parts of the globe. But there is an overlap, but it's not necessarily the same as listenership and production. And some of the research around North America and the high penetration rate is that yes, there's infrastructure. There's a high rate of ownership of smartphones and smart devices, digital devices, but it's about that established podcast culture as well. Like I said, so behaviours, cultures driving technology, technology driving some of those other things. For those of us, or for those who told us a little bit earlier, kind of what they listen to podcasts on. This is according to Buzzsprout. Last year, Apple iPhones, Android phones, smartphones. That's the thing that is really drove podcast technology in the early days. Continues to still be the main way in which people are accessing the podcast media that they want to consume. That probably stands to reason. For me personally, I think it's probably 95% of the time is on my phone. It's very rare that I will listen at my computer. And I have some articles here that I will just drop in the chat for those of you, as I was looking at some of the international data. This is one for South Africa, dropping in. This was a really interesting one with Ireland. There was some really fascinating, quite very detailed data in Ireland. I think it's just the Republic, but I stand corrected on that. I think it was just the Republic. Looking also at the consumption of digital media more broadly as well, and where podcasts are located in that. So news, for example, but also listening to music and other digital forms of media. US and the UK is one there, and I found one for Canada. So apologies for some of the global north kind of focus on this. It is a bit hard to find other information, but please, if anybody does have any to hand, please drop it in the chat, and please bring it to my attention as well. A really important thing as well to recognise, and I think this comes into your planning of any particular podcast, which we'll touch on in a bit, is that research suggests that podcast listeners are quite loyal. Once they have found and liked your podcast, they will keep listening. And not only will they keep listening to future episodes, not necessarily the moment that they arrive and land or drop on their phone, at the moment they're released, but they will get round to it. But once they start listening to an episode, they will go to the end of the episode. Yeah, they will stick with it. And that's a really important thing, I think, to bear in mind, that podcast listeners tend to be loyal. Now, that's not to say that we subscribe to every single one we listen to. Very often, I'll hold my hands up, I can listen to something and I can be turned on or off or on by it within the first couple of minutes. Yeah. So it is important that you have something that really kind of catches people's attention early on, that your key kind of messaging, that flavour, that personality, that character comes through really quickly and really early on, because it could be that's making the decision on the part of people who have stumbled across your podcast, perhaps, to keep listening. It's that old adage, first impressions last. I think there is a lot of that applies to the technology. If, however, you are driving a very focused, targeted audience towards your podcast, you may have a little bit more luxury. You may have a little bit more time to get them to subscribe, to get them to establish that loyalty. But the research suggests that once that loyalty has been established, it dissipates very, very slowly, if at all. In fact, that sense of community actually begins to develop around those podcasts. Like I said, I'll come back to that. Okay. Really keen to hear from yourselves. Sorry, I got one more. Sorry, I forgot to press enter on that one. So why are we podcasting? What is the point of it all? About reaching people, yeah. So connecting with people, building solidarities, connecting with one's peers, people who are like you, people who share the same interests and passions as you, people who are working in community development, people who want a fairer, more just world and society globally, within their region, within their country, and so on. Yeah, that's why Laurie, for example, reached out to me not so long ago to put her podcast on my radar, and that's why I've done the same to other people. We want to connect with people who are like us and share similar passions and interests to us. We also want to reach people because we frankly want to influence them. Yeah. Why is the IAC doing its podcast? It's to promote the merits and the values of community development approaches and the discipline and the profession, and to raise awareness that there are standards and so on. There is usually a reason around influencing behind most people's podcasts. Yeah. A really key one, certainly for those of us who might be working in or alongside a HE or an FE, so higher education or further education context, increasingly being used for learning. A big podcast that I'm a fan of, and I'll drop the name in here, is The Dig Radio by Jacobin, who people might recognise as a magazine traditionally. The Dig very much puts wears its sort of heart on its sleeve, in the sense that it talks about being not just a podcast, it's a political education project. Yeah, it's about learning. It's about bringing to quite a wide audience, in their case, the attention to quite a wide audience of what is going on in the world. Yeah, so they've put some episodes about what's going on in Iran, in the Middle East at the moment, because of very much kind of what they're about. I've learned a huge amount about it and about imperialism in the Middle East, because of the UK and the US's history there, and so on and so forth. But I've also learned an awful lot about Iran and the Shah and all this sort of stuff. So it's there very much for learning, formally and informally. And I think this is a really huge growth area for them, particularly, as I said, within the more kind of formalised or semi-formal education sector. Another reason is the extent to which they can become that alternative to, and it's a bit of a hackneyed phrase now, but mainstream media. Yeah, there's no controlling of content so much. Yes, there's an editing process perhaps, and there are controls, and there might be sort of regulations, and there might be protocols within your organisation that you have to abide by. But you're not having to try to send a press release to get your news to the BBC or to a national broadcaster. There's fewer editorial filters. You can say what you want to say on your podcast. Yeah, which brings with it challenges and responsibilities, which we'll come to. But it's that sense that we can create something that's a bit more community-led, yeah, that's a bit more community-owned, that is providing a voice to people like us, yeah, and therefore can also cover the topics ignored by the mainstream media, perhaps, yeah. Some other reasons might be the ability to then discuss topics in more depth and detail. So, for example, the Dig, the Jacobin, I mean, again, some of the podcasts you've described here, maybe their episodes are about 30 to 35, 40 minutes long. For me, that's relatively short form. You can get quite a lot done and cover quite a lot of detail in that time. Some of the Jacobin and the Dig episodes can be 2 hours, 2.5 hours. They are long form. I might take me 3 or 4 sittings to get through one, yeah. That's fine. It allows for an awful lot of scope to really get beneath the skin of something, to have maybe 2 guests on who might have slightly different perspectives on an issue, yeah? Particularly when something is as nuanced as geopolitics as well, of course. So the ability to really get beneath the skin of something is really, I think, important. And that's something we really did try to do with that IACD series, the one that was related to the standards book from 2022. And to get a breadth of voice as well. So we went to lots of different territories. There's people from Mongolia, from Australia, Canada, Ireland, Scotland, all of those different voices. Hong Kong's another one onto that podcast. And to demonstrate that kind of richness and diversity. And that sense of, you have that sense of loyalty, but that sense that an audience is engaged. Your listenership, as I prefer to call it, is engaged. Yeah, they're there because they're interested in the topic, or at the very least they're curious about it. Yeah, it may turn out that actually they're not that interested after all once they've listened to an episode, and that's fine. People always vote with their feet up to a point, but it's that sense that you can really get beneath the skin of a topic in a way that maybe an article on the BBC website that's around rolling news doesn't do to the same degree. It's meeting 2 different needs. I fully appreciate that. This is a really important one as well, about providing representation and diversity of experience and perspective, about maybe re-indigenizing and decolonizing things as well. It's a massive agenda within podcast media, and one I'm not going to claim to be an expert on. But I think that's really important. I remember a few years ago, I was about to deliver some training in a community centre in Butetown in Cardiff Docks. It's a very, very ethnically diverse community, some of the oldest ethnic minority communities in the whole of the UK live in Cardiff Docks communities. And there was a young lady there, and we got chatting, and I sort of said I was doing some training about podcasts, and she says, "Oh, I do a podcast." I said, "Oh, what's that about?" And she said, "It's about my experience in dating within the arranged marriage arena." And she was a young woman of Somali heritage, and I was just like, wow, well, I never knew that existed, but why wouldn't it? Because it's, the world's a diverse place. The podcast media that's out there reflects that diversity. There's something out there for everybody. It kind of reminded me. But again, she is providing experiences and insight into something for other people who are like her, similar faith, similar ethnicities, heritage, all that sort of thing. And I think that's really, really important. And I think my gut feeling is, and again, I don't claim to be an expert on these sorts of issues, but my gut feeling is that that's something that isn't necessarily portrayed within mainstream media all that often, or maybe in a way that portrays it in a sympathetic light. So what is that young lady doing? She's basically taking control of the means of production of her experiences and her perspectives via podcast media, and all power to her. And those podcasts, and certainly when I meet people who are interested in getting those sort of podcasts off the ground, they really motivate me and enthuse me. And I'd love to think that, maybe a year on from now, there's people in this audience now with us today in this webinar who can point to their own podcast doing something similar. And promoting your expertise, yeah. There's an old adage, I don't know if this applies globally, but certainly it does in the UK. I hear a lot of people sort of say this in community development: we don't blow our own trumpet enough. We're not very good at selling ourselves and the impact of the work we do. This is a really good way of actually doing that, yeah. And doing it in a way that leaves you with a fair degree of confidence that it is being heard by people as well. What they do with that information, what they do, having listened to it, well, that's another question. But that sense that we can talk about what we do, the impact we have, the values that underpin it, demonstrates our authority, our expertise in a topic, learning all along as well, but to do that in a way that people kind of go, oh, these guys know what they're talking about. I'm gonna go and explore some of the things they were talking about. I'm gonna hit them up on Facebook. I'm gonna visit their website. Yeah, I'm gonna download that report or whatever it might be. So I'm interested in what people think about that. Maybe there's some reasons that I haven't thought of. I'd be curious to hear about some of the reasons that you may have in mind, what you want to achieve with a podcast, or some of the reasons why a podcast that you listen to exists. There may well be reasons outside of that, and please drop that in the chat. I think as well, what's really, really interesting, of course, is that for all of those reasons, why not? It could be really interesting. Yeah, we could do this, or you could do this because you can. Yeah, it's the same reason people go mountain climbing. Yeah, it's because the mountain's there, and to climb it might be fun, it might be exhilarating, we're going to have the time of our life, we might learn something, it might be a bit dangerous, it might feel a bit unsafe, but why not? Let's give it a go. And that is a perfectly valid reason for starting a podcast. And dare I say, it probably was the reason behind the vast majority of those, whatever it was, 4.9 million podcasts that exist. May not be enough to sustain them, as the stats showed a moment ago, but I'm a big believer in just why not? So yeah, please let me know what it is that is maybe motivating you to be curious about this sort of media. And you're welcome to come off mute. And if there's any questions, comments, observations on any of that, then I'd love to hear them, and I'll wet the whistle.
So I'm just starting a project with some Scottish Gypsy traveller communities who hoping to make a podcast kind of about people's experience of discrimination towards them, and kind of sharing, I suppose, them, as you say, being in charge of how they put their story across.
Yeah, absolutely. So by the sounds of it, your podcast is providing them with a platform that perhaps isn't necessarily readily available to them, or if it is made available, it comes maybe with a whole load of conditions attached to it, and it's providing representation, diversity, and that diversity of experience, and in particular their experience. I'm curious, who's the audience for that, Anna?
That's one thing that we need to sort of clarify. We're about to start sort of training and sort of preparation sessions together, so we need to drum it down, because I think part of it is we'd like it to kind of influence non-travelers in kind of people's perceptions, and so I think we need to, that's obviously something we need to kind of narrow down when we start it, I think, because it's kind of general at the moment, but
You're probably no doubt on the right path. I think that is I think that's something that is worth doing. I don't think it's necessarily something that you you wed yourself to. That's the audience, and that can only ever be the audience. It can evolve, it can grow, it can change. But I think having a focus on who we want to reach with our podcast as a whole, maybe individual episodes have specific audiences, target audiences, or listenerships. But as a podcast as a whole, I think that's always useful exercise. Just spotted your comment as well about listening to them to get the sleep. So yeah, I've been known to do that myself as well. Janine, I'm curious, an easier way to access information, easier than what? Is it easier than something else in particular that's difficult?
I'm just thinking of our part of the world where there are often broadband and internet connection issues. I think it's easier for people in countries where that's not as developed, perhaps, where you can just listen to something on your phone, whereas if otherwise you've got to go into an internet cafe or you've got to have a laptop or whatever. So I think for us down here, this part of the world, it's easier.
Sorry, it's not moved. Yes, no, I appreciate that. There is a structural issue. There is infrastructural issues. There are some stuff around demographics and behaviours, regulation at government level. Maybe national level, international level as well. Again, I'm not ignorant of those. I don't think it's necessarily for this level of detail into the medium, but certainly, yeah, all of those are valid issues. We have somebody from Manitoba whose name I forget. I'd find it if I scrolled up. I did a podcast with a chap called Michael Barkman in Winnipeg during COVID, and Michael was telling me about some work that he was doing with First Nations community quite far north of Winnipeg in Manitoba, and how that work had to move online because of COVID, but that community, that First Nations community, very much privileged and prioritised face-to-face communication, and that they didn't want to move some of that stuff onto the internet. Now, that wasn't a podcast per se, but I can also recognise that maybe there are behavioural, very deep, long-held cultural, traditional, sort of indigenous grounds for not wanting to engage with this sort of stuff as well. I think all of that, is a fascinating thing, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert on it whatsoever, but I was very struck by that that resistance in that Manitoba case to move stuff online, even though they wanted to move it online in order to keep people safe and to carry on the work. Always really, really fascinating. Like I said, apologies for any kind of overly global north kind of complexion to some of this, and welcome any sort of challenge and clarification on some of that. Some of the comments. There is an interesting. So I mentioned earlier we've got a series coming out with IACD coming out in a couple of weeks. Anastasia Crickley, who I'm sure will be known to everybody on this call, touches on some of the work that she's done with travellers in the Irish community in the UK as well. That might have some resonance as that. Any thoughts on ethical considerations recording people's lived experience when there is vulnerability? Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I think is really creeping into this now is this sense into this media now by way of producing them, and it is something to bear in mind for those of us on the call who are looking to take this a little bit further. Is maybe Hannah, if I may use what you've just said as an example, experiences of discrimination are traumatic. Clearly, by definition, and there is a danger that I think there is a need to be respectful of that and to be trauma informed about some of this stuff. No more or differently trauma informed than we may otherwise be as practitioners on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, but also recognising that it may trigger certain reactions amongst listeners as well. So I think there's an ethical dimension there, and I said I'm covering ethics in a moment because I think it is a really, really important aspect to it. I think there's also something around in terms of the vulnerability, and maybe there's a few different ways of defining that term in terms of your, or maybe you're defining it in a certain way, Chris, in terms of your question, but there's different ways of interpreting it, is around, I wouldn't ever want my podcast, my community development one, my personal one, to be seen as some sort of rubbernecking of issues that are going on. Yeah, issues that are kind of like, you're poking or picking at scabs. I remember doing an episode with community development work in East Belfast, and the Troubles in Northern Ireland was still a very real material impact on his work. And he was quite happy to talk about some of that stuff and the challenges that brings him. But I was very, very worried that I was being seen as kind of rubbernecking and wanting to kind of, rake up old coals, or whatever the metaphor is, the saying is. So there's something definitely there to be alert to, and I think it's something to factor into the planning of maybe, say, your first 10 to 12 episodes. So if we want to do a podcast that is going to explore discrimination, for example, then, or rights-based approaches, we did the episode around rights around housing, didn't we, Hannah, a while back, for my podcast, is recognising, okay, what are the ethical concerns within in relation to the topic at hand, and I'm sure that everybody on this call would do their very best to really thoroughly interrogate those, but there might always be something that you get wrong. There might be something you don't quite go far enough. You haven't quite dotted every I and crossed every T. So a little bit of humility, I think, is always really, really important when you're being in, like I said, that privileged position of the producer or the convener of the podcast or the host of the conversations. Okay. Ethical storytellers. Looks like there's a useful link there from Anna. Okay. Unless there's any other questions, I will press on. We're going to start talking a little bit about the technology, a little bit about the jargon. Okay. There are lots of options for hosting. So a podcast has to be hosted somewhere. Yeah, it has to exist somewhere, in the same way that a website has to exist sort of somewhere. We may not understand how or why they're hosted and what is going on behind the scenes, but it does need to be somewhere. Now, the IACD uses the platform SoundCloud. Okay, I use SoundCloud for a couple of mine. I use it a lot, and I do recommend it a lot for non-profit organisations, voluntary organisations. I'm not on commission. I hasten to add, not on commission for any of these things that I'm recommending. I'm not recommending, I'm just saying this is what I use and giving you the reasons why I use them. One of the reasons why I like SoundCloud is that it's simple to set up. And there's a lot to be said for simplicity, and it's pretty simple. Like anything, once you know, and you've got your head around it, it's fairly simple to manage. It connects to your social media really easily, yeah. And usually, most of us will have a fairly active or be involved in an ecosystem in terms of our work where there's quite a lot of activity on social media. It connects with all of those very, very well. And the best podcasts do tend to have a good, strong social media game. Yeah, it's a way in which you can, bring your podcast and new episodes to people's attention, and a way of reaching out and gaining feedback from people as well. SoundCloud can be easily embedded on your website, your organizational website, perhaps, and it's also quite good for connecting with other platforms, which is the syndication bit, which we will come to. Now, with SoundCloud, as with most other platforms, there's a basic tariff and there's a paid and a pro tariff. Now, I'm only going to talk about SoundCloud because it's the one I know the best, but as a general rule, they're all very, very similar. The basic tariff on SoundCloud allows you 3 hours. You get 3 hours for free. Anybody could set up a SoundCloud account now and they'd have 3 hours of content. That might be 1 3-hour episode, 3 1-hour episodes, or do the maths, however many slices you want to cut that cake into, but you get 3 hours. After that, any new content replaces your earliest content. That is one of their ways in which it's trying to drive you to take out one of the paid/pro tariffs. Okay. IACD pays for a pro tariff. I pay for a pro tariff for a couple of my podcasts. For me personally, I find it's good value for money, and it works out at, I think at the moment, £75 per annum. You can also pay monthly, it'll be a little bit more, and £75 works out about €86 and about $100. Okay, but about £75. So it's not free. There is a cost, but I don't think that's extortionate necessarily. But it's all relative. I fully appreciate that. What I really like about it as well is then this thing around syndication. So you're hosted somewhere, one place. But if I was to say that our podcast can only be listened to on SoundCloud, and somebody goes, "Oh, I listen on Spotify. I'm not going to go anywhere else. I listen on Spotify." It's the syndication that gets that podcast that's on SoundCloud to the Spotify listener, to the YouTube, Acast, Podbean, LibSync, Google, yada, yada, yada. Okay? So the syndication bit is really important, and it uses a technology for some of us who are a bit older in the room, who remembers, when the internet kind of started and email started, you could subscribe to websites through an RSS feed. And I can remember when I would get maybe stuff in my inbox, my email inbox, saying so-and-so website has updated, it's added new content, or a new news site has got a new news item. Early blogging used this technology. It hasn't really evolved. Why? Because it worked to begin with and it works now. RSS, and that's that logo there, or maybe slight variations of it, okay? And it stands for really simple syndication, okay? This is about as technical as we get today, but it is really important. It is the thing that gets your podcast from its hosting point in front of all the people all over the world using all of those different platforms, okay? RSS. Now, where it exists, where it is found in the platforms, that needs a little bit more investigation, and it is probably a level of a sort of detail that will be on a different sort of webinar or on a different training course that I might be hosting. But they are all there, okay? What I like about SoundCloud is that it isn't buried deep within. It is literally, once you find it, and it's got a big kind of massive flashing arrow going, this is your RSS link, it's cut and paste into all of those other platforms, yeah? So that when I upload a new episode, so when we upload the new series, Anna, Jess and I, to the IACD SoundCloud account, you can subscribe in any other platform, but as soon as it's up there and we go, it's live, you will get that podcast pinging up on your device, whichever device you use to listen to podcasts on, okay? This is how you get onto those other platforms, which are, frankly, a lot more popular than SoundCloud, yeah? So like I said, there's others that have a far bigger audience, and you might actually find an audience and your listeners a little bit quicker. But like I said, I like SoundCloud for one, its affordability, relatively speaking, and its relative simplicity, and the things that it does well. Okay. I very, very rarely ever listen to a podcast in SoundCloud though, but I host a lot of mine there. Yeah. Like I said, I'm a Podbean user. You all use other ones. Most of those podcasts probably are findable on SoundCloud as well. Okay. One thing to bear in mind is, so those of us who use Apple's a perfect case in point, as was Google Podcasts. Spotify's another case in point, although I do wonder where they're going. But certainly Apple doesn't host, and iTunes was its predecessor, doesn't host podcasts. Yeah. It streams them from other places. It is pulling them in from other quarters. It has no interest necessarily in hosting all of that content, but it does want to pull it all in and then send it out to the audience, okay? And it's RSS that's powering a lot of that. Okay, but in terms of platforms, there are dozens of them. There are loads and loads and loads of options. Any questions on that? Because as I said, that's the jargony, technical bit that we spend most time on. There's a question there from Dennis. Do IACD or others you would recommend get actively involved in helping set one up? Ooh, I'm not aware of any sort of organisations that help get podcasts set up. I mean, I do for organisations. I think as a general rule, I think this is something that we haven't necessarily interrogated enough at IACD. I know, Jess, you've been party to a couple of conversations with Anna. I think there's a desire, rather than the IACD be the podcast that covers all community development, I think one of the things we would love to be able to see and how that comes about needs a bit more thought. But you have this ecosystem of podcasts that are fairly regular, fairly frequent, looking at community development in all of its richness and its diversity around the globe, and they're all kind of loosely perhaps connected, that they're not necessarily kind of formally affiliated with and so on, but there is that kind of ecosystem. Some people may be luckier in getting funding to fund the development of theirs. Some people, might want to go down the advertising and monetization route, whereas others don't or aren't allowed to. So there would be enough scope for the diversity that I think of experience potentially out there. But maybe it's a conversation to be had after this about, okay, strategizing and how one gets one off the ground. But we are looking at some of the planning that I think is important. Okay, I'll press on. Building a listenership. Like I said, I do use the word just because it's so ubiquitous a word. But the term audience isn't one that particularly motivates me within this sort of audience, within this sort of this sort of reasons that people like yourselves have for maybe starting a podcast. That word listenership is what I much prefer. Okay. And here are just some, I don't know, some prompts, some tips. Yeah, ask people what they want. You know, we work in contexts where we are constantly listening to people, taking on what they've said, listening to their feedback, flying a couple of kites, suggesting things getting shot down. We're part of that. Why would our podcast exist in a bubble outside of that? Ask people what they want. Do you want quite detailed, complex, rich, thorough, long form, episodes, or do you want something that's a bit shorter, punchier, yeah, that maybe scratches the surface a little bit but gives you some of the links and the signposting to other things to do your own individual learning? Yeah, do you want a mixture? Yeah, how often do you want an episode? 5 times a week, or do you want one every 6 months? Yeah, those questions, ask yourselves. There's no definitive answer to any of these, but just look at just ask yourself those questions and ask other people. And there'll be people, I'm sure, that when it comes to project ideas and things like that, you go and you inquire. You get their thoughts on something. You want their feedback, their opinion. The podcast is very much the same. This, I think, is always really interesting. When will your listeners want to listen? Yeah, if you're going to do a big 2.5 hour deep dive, yeah, into structuralism and community development, that's a big ask to expect someone to listen to that either work during the working day, or to then do it of an evening when they might just want to put their feet up and watch reality TV or listen to true crime. Yeah, so bear that in mind. Yeah. But there might be a time and a place to do that. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't ever do it, but bear in mind that some people might take their time to come around to listen to that, yeah? Because it might need to have there's a certain sort of time that they need to get their headspace for that, yeah? I listen to a lot of my longer form ones when I'm out for a walk, when I'm cooking, when I'm down the allotment, and so on, yeah? Some people are listening on the commute. Some people might want to not listen to something that's work related, that busman's holiday. I don't know how that phrase translates outside of the UK. That sense that I spend all day talking about community development and community work and all that kind of stuff, and I'm going to listen to a 2-hour episode of the evening. It is nevertheless much of a vocation for a lot of us as well. So I listen to a lot of politics and stuff outside as well. So like I said, we're all a little bit different, but just bear that in mind. If it's going to be during the working day potentially, or at least on the commute or over the lunch break, then maybe you might go, my audience probably deserves a little bit of levity. Yeah, they want it to be a little punchier, a little bit quicker to get through. Yeah. How will your audience listen? We looked at listen. Is it not just on devices? Is it going to be in one sitting? Is it in several sittings? Yeah. Is it commuting? Is it traveling during the working day? Bearing all that in mind, if you're asking people during the course of your conversation to click on this link, to visit this website, to like this Facebook page, to do this, that, and the other, while they're driving, well, that ain't going to happen. Yeah. If it's maybe they're sitting back, kicking back, relaxing, going through a little bit of admin maybe in the office, and the phone's off the hook, well then fair enough. Respect your audience, respect your listeners. Yeah, if you respect them, they'll respect you. They will cut you some slack when you put out an episode, as I have any number of times on different things where you go, didn't quite zing, did it? It didn't quite. I don't know. Hey, listen, they're like buses. There'll be another one along in due course. Or, and it does happen to me even after all this time, where you go in, best of intentions, to an episode, and it just doesn't happen. It doesn't work. The quality's not there, and you're not obliged to put anything out. Your listeners will cut you some slack. Yeah, if you respect them, they'll respect you. Okay. Clicking. Where's my slides going? There we go. So like I said, audience versus listenership versus community. I want to say good podcasts. I think there is an element of this. So successful podcasts have that sense of community. I know people listen to other podcasts I listen to, and we will talk about some of those episodes. Did you listen to so-and-so? I haven't got round to it yet. Absolute brilliant. Yeah, people do that. Yeah, outside of the confines of the actual episode. Yeah, a lot of them have. There's one I listen to, The Evolution of Horror, which is about horror films, which is a bit of an interest of mine. It has its own Discord group. Yeah, I've no idea what Discord is. I must confess, I've never gone there, but it's very active. Some have Facebook groups around it. So this ecosystem of other stuff tends to evolve around podcasts. I'm not saying necessarily that those will around your podcast, around your work and your organizations. It's a bit nicher than that. And the listenership is going to be far smaller in all likelihood compared to something like that, for example. But nevertheless, people develop a connection. And that word community really motivates intrinsically us and a lot of the people we work with. Of course it does. Why would it not then when it comes to things like podcast media? Okay. So like I said, you tend to get to know hosts quite well. You know where they live. You know their dog's name. You know, I listened to one and his dog passed away. It was Mr. Puggles. I was heartbroken. I'm not a doggy person personally, but he had loads of email and it was awful. We felt it because we're part of the community of those listeners. Yeah. We get to know those things because it's that intimate, for want of a better word, experience. How many of you have emailed one of the podcasts that you listen to? Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Just pop it in the thing. I really loved your episode. Really fascinating. Thanks for putting that on my radar. One of the horror ones I listened to, I've discovered a huge amount of bands that I now absolutely adore because he has this interface between music and horror films. So, I've learned so much. Well, why would I not tell him that I'm really grateful for finding this band? So I will do that, not with every podcast, but only with some. But that community kind of develops. You can follow and engage on social media. Like I said, you discuss episodes. There might be message boards and all sorts of other things. A lot of podcasts now are going into the live space and they'll do live recordings and you can go and be in the audience while they're doing it, and that is the recording that then goes out on the stream, on the feed, a week or two later or whatever. Yeah, fascinating. It's just another way in which we can connect with those other funny little frogs who share our funny little quirky interests and our funny little quirky professions and practice. I love that about this, and it's something to really give some thought to. It's not just this thing that records a conversation, gets thrown out. It develops into other things. I won't name any names necessarily, but I've done an episode fairly recently with somebody on my community development podcast, and that person and I have worked together on a tender that we've put in for a piece of work. I didn't know that person, who's an IACD member, I will say that much, until one of the online events a few months ago. So like I said, things can really develop and evolve and can be really quite meaningful, which I think is lovely because sometimes the internet can feel a bit shallow and a bit kind of one-dimensional. So, yeah. Any questions? And then I suggest we take a 10-minute break and we reconvene. But happy to hear anything that people want to say, want to share, want to challenge.
Dennis has another question there in the chat.
Yeah, is that I've got my glasses on? Is that Coeasy? Actually, take on board that. Yeah, less. Bit more diversity in these is great. I think what's interesting is that there's not a huge amount of data out there, and I did look. Like I said, I found it for South Africa. Didn't find a huge amount else. There may well be some data and statistics, obviously, in languages that I don't speak either. So there's something of that. What I would suggest is that there does seem to be an appetite to generate the data and to do the surveys and the research into digital media consumption in the broader sense. If not specifically podcasts. So I suspect that if you know kind of what you're looking for and the different kind of countries and jurisdictions and languages that you're wanting to find it, I'd be surprised if it's particularly hard to find. And if you find it, then please send it over because I'd be more than interested. Okay.
And then Dennis was saying he knows of a new community podcast in Cork, which is aligned with the local radio station and allowed to use their studio.
Oh,
He's planning to approach the local radio, but conscious that they might see it as competition. Is there a precedent?
That's really interesting. I did an episode, so I put an episode out on my community development podcast around community philosophy about 2 years ago. So I convene in Cardiff, where I live, a philosophy in pubs group, or philosophy in public as that now is. So it's just a few people come together once a fortnight. It is in a pub, admittedly, and we philosophize. So it's not about philosophy, it's not about philosophers, it's the doing of philosophizing around some of the big complex issues of the day. Why are we here? Would you eat your cat? It can be frivolous, it can be serious, it can be sober, it can be fun. And a local independent radio station in Cardiff, I think it's called Radio Cardiff, have a community slot. And one of the members said, why don't you go on that? They're always looking for community ideas. Went on, gave me the recording to then edit into a podcast episode. My experience, limited as it is with radio stations, is that actually you can generate content for them, they can generate content for you. You can raise awareness of their station and then vice versa. I think possibly there is some competition in some very kind of very specific area potentially, but actually I just find they tend to recognize community media and community sort of motivated media through the same lens that they see their own efforts as a radio station. There's a really good podcast called Decentered Media, and it's Centre, Center. I'll maybe drop the link in the chat. That a friend of mine, Rob Watson, based in Leicester, runs. He is a doctor of community media. He comes at this a much more academic kind of lens, and he says that basically they're the same thing. People's behaviours engage differently with them. They may have different budgets available to them, but a podcast and the different kind of programs on a community radio station are basically the same thing. I tend to defer a lot to Rob in terms of his expertise and wisdom on these things. I think there's something in that, and therefore, why would there be, overtly, too much perception of there being competition? If you do find that, I sense, Dennis or anyone else listening to this, that probably says more about the station than it does about your podcasting efforts, would be my gut feeling on that one. Anything else? Otherwise, we'll take a 10-minute break and reconvene. There isn't but migrants and refugees. Yeah, that's a really, really interesting one, Dennis. I won't read the question out. It's there for people to read. There's a slightly, and I apologise, this sounds a little bit more frivolous than I mean it to. The issue of the black rugby player that got some racial abuse, who came on for Ireland a couple of weeks ago, in the Six Nations. That, if you had your podcast up and running and say it was 6-9 months old, that would be a great touchstone to raise the profile of what you're discussing on a much more day-to-day, week-to-week, dare I say, mundane basis in where we live. I'm not saying it's a mundane experience for people, absolutely not. But that becomes a high-profile expression of some of the things that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Like I said, I don't mean that we exploit those things, but what you would tend to find is that the mainstream media would come to you to ask for your perspectives on this. Is it just this, I forget Edwin something or other, is it just Edwin that gets this experience? Oh no, this is the lived and material experience of an awful lot of people in our community, and our podcast is here to not just show that and prove it and demonstrate it, but to interrogate it. There we go, Edwin Edogbo. Okay. So I'm not quite answering specifically the question, but I think there's something in there around, by definition, when you are raising these issues, you will get some pushback. How you deal with that, there's no simple answer. If you're doing it within an organisational setting, you may have policies and protocols for how you deal with that sort of misinformation and some of the abuse that you might get just on social media, on Twitter, for example. So, like I said, anything that is around how do you deal with these things has to fit with how organisationally you already manage them. And you may need to explore and tweak those protocols to reflect the fact that you'll be putting podcast media out. You can lock episodes down so you don't get any comments on them. Yeah, I've done that once or twice. Usually I don't mind trying to bring some of these people out of the woodwork a little bit and to challenge some of those things. Touch wood, I've had very, very little over the years. If you then post a link to a brand new episode that's talking about, for example, racism in Ireland or discrimination amongst asylum seekers and refugees in Ireland, and you put a link to that on social media, there's a good chance you're going to get some sort of nonsense in the replies or comments. You probably have a protocol and a routine to follow. My gut feeling is it is more or less the same. But are we not there in terms of our practice, our work, our values to challenge these things? Is our podcast potentially not a tool in challenging those? It's for you to decide what your appetite is the earlier point, and I forget who made it on the panel there, around vulnerability, those comments on trauma informed, you know, it's not there, I would argue, to kind of go, oh, look at this person who's experienced racism. Oh, isn't it bad? Yeah. Thank you for the episode. Please give us a like, leave a comment, share. You know, how you do it, I think it's really important how you create that voice. How you literally, the next slide we come back to after the break is finding our voice. Is really key to it. And I'm not saying it's easy. It's not. It takes practice. It takes confidence and assertiveness. It's not everybody's cup of tea to be that natural. Hi, welcome to the new episode. This week we are talking about racism. Well, we have to talk about it. We've got these instances going on. We are going to be talking. It's not. Some people like to work in the margins. They like to work in the background, and there's room for all of it. I think the best podcasts that may emanate out of this sort of audience and our sort of work are very much a reflection of how we work and the spaces that we work in. I don't know if that answers that, Dennis, but happy to have a conversation about it afterwards. And I'd love to hear what your experiences are and what you end up deciding. I mean, you know, maybe Hannah's got something to share in terms of the themes that she was talking about taking to a podcast media. I don't know. I don't have the time in front of me. I'm in other people's hands. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll reconvene and we'll be looking at voice planning and some of the things around getting it off the ground.
Thanks, Russell.
15:26. We'll call it 9 minutes. Let's call it 15:35.
Back to you, Russell. I think we can carry on. Last 25 minutes.
The robotic recording voice, that's always the cue, isn't it? Okay, so on the home run, finding your voice. I think this is really important, only insofar as, you know, you've got to enjoy doing this because it is quite labour intensive, a podcast. So find your voice, find what comes naturally to you. There is an element, I think, probably in all of us to want to maybe sort of perform or to put on the posh phone voice or whatever it might be. But I think authenticity is really important with podcasts. And again, I think the most successful ones feel pretty authentic. Like I said, you get to know people, their foibles, warts and all. There's an element of that there. I mean, there's that whole kind of subset of sort of celebrity and influencer culture. And it's not my cup of tea, where perhaps it's not as authentic as it's being made out. But I think certainly the work we're involved in and the people we work with, they suss us out if we're not being authentic. So I think there's a lot to be said for applying that to our podcast media. So practice, yeah, you know, in the shower, in the mirror, with one another, on the way to work, whatever else it might be. Rehearse how you're going to start that episode with a little bit of a zing, yeah, but a bit of, you know, pizzazz to get people in. That first impression counts, yeah. In terms of the editing, if you're the person that's going to be editing, and I'm going to touch on whether you're doing this on your own, is it part of a team, and how you might divide the labour up. But if, for example, it's me doing my community development podcast, and I have guests coming in, like I said, Hannah's come in and all that, you spend an awful lot of time listening to your own voice. And most people hate listening to their own voice. Get used to it. So the sooner you get used to it, the easier and the better it'll get. Well, I'm saying the better it'll get. It might always sound horrific to you, but you just get used to it. You spend a lot of time in your own company. You spend a lot of time with headphones on. That bit is not everybody's cup of tea. I'll come back to that in a moment. A few people say to me, oh, maybe we should do like a couple of pilot episodes. We should do maybe like 4 or 5. If you want, if you've got the time, if you feel that's what you need to do, then fine. I'm not going to say don't do it. But actually, that's quite a lot of effort to put into something that you then decide is never going to see the light of day. And actually, the sooner you find your voice by doing it properly, then I think better in the long run. And you can always take down the early episodes anyway if you think actually looking back they're a bit cringeworthy. I also a big believer in put your early episodes out there, and if maybe you don't go public to the whole wide world initially, you put them out there and you get some feedback on them. Yeah. So it could be, Dennis, for argument's sake, just because you're the name I can see on the chat most recently, you do 2 or 3 episodes, and then you have a particular audience in mind, particular listenership in mind. You go to them and say, listen, how does this sound? Is it too serious? Is it not serious enough? You know, is the pace? Is it too long? Is it too short? Is it too slow? Is it? Get some feedback on it. I'm literally working at the moment on a podcast series with Cardiff University and its School of History on some of the work around how to teach Welsh history in a new curriculum, school curriculum we've got in Wales for primary school, so like 11 and under, and as a teacher they've recruited to host it, and he's great. We've done one episode, he has sent it to a couple of his teaching colleagues, and they've got some feedback. Well, we need to take that on board because they're the very people we want to be listening to these things. So you could do a pilot episode, 4, 5, 6 episodes, and find that actually, yeah, we've got it, and then people push back and go, oh, didn't really push my buttons, sorry Russ. But you will know who you want to reach. Yeah, and if you don't yet, give it some more thought, is why I asked the question of Hannah a little bit. I think it's a really important question to ask. Get some feedback off people. It also takes time to find your voice, so give it some time. Yeah? You're not going to nail it immediately. You might do, but you probably won't. I never did. And it takes confidence, yeah, to really kind of go, right, what are we doing today? We're going to talk about this issue. I don't know anything about this issue, but the guest does. Fine, I just got to make them sound great, yeah? And some of that is in the prep, some of that is in how you make them feel at ease and things like that. But finding your own voice is a key part of it, but it comes more naturally and more quickly to some people than others. Don't beat yourself up over it. If you'll find it's taking you a while, or it feels like the pair of shoes, they're still rubbing a little bit. Even if after 10 12 episodes you still feel a bit, oh, this isn't me, I don't like. Chances are you are coming out of a comfort zone. Yeah. Okay. The team, or doing it on your own. Like I said, it's very labor intensive. I'm pretty good and pretty quick now at editing. It takes me about 3 minutes to edit 1 minute. That's a very, very broad ratio. Is that a ratio? It is a ratio, isn't it? Yeah, 1 to 3, or 3 to 1. Factor in the fact that I might have spoken to someone for an hour. That's an hour of my time. So that's 60 minutes. Well, I want 40 minutes episode out of that. I don't know, Hannah, how long did we chat? There's 3 of us in that episode. There's the time setting up to prep it. There's the time checking the connection and getting rid of the gremlins in the system, etc., etc. It takes a lot of time. Time is money for some organisations, indeed maybe all. So if you're doing it on your own, you need to get some slack cut from above, elsewhere in your team. If it is a vocational busman's holiday for you, you're doing this in addition to your day job, well, that's on you. But you do what you need to do. But if you're taking maybe a team approach, or there's the potential for that I think is where you can really begin to get some really good, solid, and in the longer term, sort of sustainable podcasts up and running. Because someone is doing the preparation of guests, somebody is doing the editing, someone is doing the hosting, getting the questions ready, rehearsing, practicing, getting a little bit of zing and a bit of life into the episode. Yeah, someone is doing the uploading and the RSS and the yada, and typing all the show note. Yeah. If you can do that, great. Might need coordination. That might be a luxury that's not available to other people. But don't feel it has to be just you on your own all of the time. Yeah. Bring other people in. Consider that, like I said, that team approach. And I think sometimes the host might be that person that's a little bit more naturally outgoing, a little bit better. The ones who are quite happy to stand up in front of people. They're quite happy to do presentations. In fact, you put a camera in them and they jump in front of it. They push everybody else out the way. Yeah, the divas in your team, give them the hosting job. They can be the front of house. They're the ones that give it that life, that joie de vivre. The editor might be the person that doesn't want to be involved, doesn't want to speak, but is the the bass player in the band. Yeah, he's just there in the pocket at the back, doing the heavy lifting of the editing. It's a slow, laborious, pretty boring process. AI is changing some of these things, don't get me wrong, but I'm just coming at it from my perspective. You might then have somebody who's pushing the episode out the nest, that person in the social media team, the comms team. You may need to negotiate some of their time, a week out from recording and editing your episode to make sure that then finds an audience or reaches a people. Yeah, because although you might have already 100 subscribers, you want 110. Those 10 that you want, they're the ones you focus next week. And the next episode is another 10. And you do it like that. And like I said, there could be somebody reaching out, picking up the phone, saying, oh, Janine, love you to come on our episode. Harley, love to come on our next episode. Are you available next month? Oh, I've got a massive deadline. How about 2 months later? Perfect, that's fine. Janine, I need you a bit sooner. Someone's doing all of that. What are we going to talk about? Here are our themes for this short series. Recording in haste, edit at leisure. You could do 3 or 4 recordings in a week. I've done 2 or 3 in one sitting, and you carve out a couple of episodes. Yeah, I'll give you a little hint, glance behind the curtain. That's how we've done a couple of these episodes coming up for the IACD. Yeah, recorded in one sitting, but they're going to be two separate episodes. So there's a few ways to skin the cat. It may be that you want to take on different roles and take it in turn. I know a podcast around Welsh politics called Hiraeth, and they do that. They basically take it in turns to do the hosting, the prepping, so that nobody is ever getting bogged down altogether, because life often gets in the way. So, yeah, working as a team. So planning your podcast, which is touching on the answer I put into the chat to, was it Marie? I saw the name, I've scrolled past it. I did reply. Marie, yes, Marie. Planning your podcast. So the slides previously touch on who do you want to reach, that team approach. Is it you? Is it part of a team that's developing this? Maybe setting up your channel. Well, we're going on SoundCloud and we're going to syndicate across. You're going to tell people that the podcast is coming. Yeah. We maybe go as a guest on somebody else's. Dennis may want to come on a future episode of the IACD to say, this is what we're going to be doing with our podcast in Ireland. We'd love you to get involved if you're also working with in a anti-racism capacity somewhere else or whatever else it might be. So you raise awareness of it, okay? That's your podcast. That's the entirety of it, okay? That's your channel. Your individual episodes, your content. Sometimes people call those their podcasts. I prefer to think that is your podcast, the entirety, your individual episodes and the things that you're recording. What do you consider success? This is a really important question. So, sorry to keep using your example, Hannah, but what is a success for your podcast? Is it just raising awareness of the issues? Yeah. Is it challenging some orthodoxies and some stereotypes, many of which are very pejorative around traveller community? Is it about influencing policy? Is it just about audience? Is it, there is an element of chauvinism in all this, and it's not something that particularly motivates me, but I do like it when I go, oh, I had 100 more listens this time than I did for the last episode, or whatever it might be. Whatever your measure of success is, or whatever your vision of success is, you need to have some idea of how to measure that. Because there may come a time, either with a funder, your manager, yourself, are we going to carry on with this? We've given it 10 to 12 months. We mapped out with all of our flip charts, our post-its and stuff. We mapped out our first 10 to 12 episodes, yeah? And we're still only getting 5 listens an episode, yeah? But it could be that you really believe that the content is really good. The content is challenging. It's challenging those orthodoxies. It's correcting some of the stereotypes. It's promoting our values. Whatever those success measures are and the quality of the content, you need to have some idea that it's worth doing. And you may have to do it because someone is asking you to demonstrate that. And I think mapping out your first 10 to 12 episodes, or maybe your first year's content, if that's one episode a month, coming back to my answer to Marie, it kind of depends what you want to achieve. I think it's something that's doing. You map out, okay, what topics are we going to do? Well, we're going to do one launch episode that gives a flavour of what we're going to be covering and why we're doing it, and introduces the guests and the organisation. Well, there's one episode there. Who's the second one? Let's get, who would put some bums on seats, metaphorically speaking? Let's get Anastasia Crickley, international perspective. She's well known. She's she's a brilliant speaker. She's been doing this stuff for donkey's years. Yeah, people would be interested in listening to her. Okay, that's fine. Or you might get a local politician, or you might get the local mayor, or you might get a local celebrity, or whoever else it might be. You get somebody that brings, your milkshake brings people to the yard. Yeah, somebody goes, oh, I could listen to that. You need some other content though. Then we're going to get into the skin of a particular topic. We're going to get people from the community. You then need to let them know. You may need to get their permission. You may need to persuade them. You may need consent forms. You need all of those sorts of things. Yeah. Go on other podcasts. All of that gets planned in. All of that day. And I think it's a couple of hours exercise. I've done it with a couple of organisations, and they always find their ideas are clearer for doing it than going, let's do the first episode and then we'll do another one and then we'll do another one. And yeah, although that's how I started, and here I still am. That's fine to kind of freewheel, but I think having some structure to that first year, I think is potentially really, really helpful. Okay. Ethics was touched on in the some of this I think is just related to your work anyway, your practice. like I said to you, we're in a privileged position. Yeah, we choose the topics, we choose the guests. Like I just said, you might choose the 10 guests. Yeah, for the first year, we edit. We ultimately decide what stays in and what stays out. Okay, there's a privilege there. Let's acknowledge that. Are you recording in a personal versus professional capacity? Yeah. If it is in a personal capacity, but it's related to your work that you do, because a lot of us are in this as a vocation, you may need to get clearance off a manager. At the very least, you may need to let them know, or trustees, or whoever else it may be. One of the things I often do is I will edit a chat, I will edit a recording, I will upload it to SoundCloud, which is what I like about it. You can leave it private, so I can send them the link. So if I've just recorded with Janine, I could say, Janine, here's the episode, here's the link. No one else can hear it yet. You can listen to it, and you're happy with that. Yeah. Now I may say, and I usually do, I will give you till the end of next week. If I don't hear anything, I will assume that it goes live because I can't wait forever. Okay. Do people have a right to reply? People have the opportunity to back out. I've had that once where someone said, do you know what? I've decided I don't really, there's a couple of things in that I'm not. I said, well, I can take those out. Do you know what? I'm not sure I want to do it. People have that right. Yeah. That little halfway measure of giving them the opportunity to listen to it back, I think is really important. Do you have a complaints procedure? What if someone listens to something? It's a variation on the comment that Dennis made, the question Dennis raised. What if someone says, well, actually, no, I think you've been a bit unfair there. You know, we did have a consultation. You may not agree with the quality of it, but we did hold one. And you said there was no consultation. There was. Ooh. Yeah. Now, touch wood, I've never had it. You may feel obliged to register with a regulator, I don't know, Ofcom in the UK and wherever else it is in your countries. That might be something you need to do, or some sort of standards body, yeah, because it is community media. That's what the radio station probably does in Cork, Dennis, for example, or wherever else you might be. Something to bear in mind. The balance of genders, ethnicities, jurisdictions, yeah, faiths, whatever context in which you're working in your podcast, you want as best you can to reflect the diversity that exists. You may actually be going specifically into that and actually giving a greater representation to certain less heard, unheard voices and identities. That's indeed your choice. But at the very least, a podcast that just has a load of middle-aged white guys like me on it isn't really, in our work, isn't really probably worth bothering with for any long period of time at the very least. I've had this a couple of times where people are speaking English as a second language, yeah, and it can be a little hard to hear sometimes. It takes a bit of time to tune in. Bear that in mind, yeah. Some people might find it harder to express themselves in certain ways. I did one episode with somebody who had a very, very pronounced stammer. I'd only ever arranged over email to get them on the podcast, and they never mentioned it. I never asked. It wasn't apparent in email. Why would it be? And then it was like, whoa, okay. It's an ethical quandary one finds oneself in, yeah? Written transcripts for hearing impaired. If people can't listen to the content, can't hear the content, what do? You can't have subtitles on a podcast unless it's going on YouTube. Maybe that's something you want to do. Are there other cultural barriers? I touched on a little bit of that earlier. Disclaimers, yeah? The views expressed in this episode are not the views of the organisation. You may have to go down that path because your organisation, the employing organisation, mandates it. Copyright, yeah? Don't get yourself into trouble. You can't use the brand new Taylor Swift song, yeah? I mean, you can try and get away with it, but that's your call. There is lots of websites where you can get free music or rights-free music. You may have to specify that you're using a particular track from so-and-so website. So freemusicarchive.org, I think it is one such. Purple Planet is another one. There's tons out there. One of the things I did on a podcast series around community archaeology project in Cardiff, we actually got one of the members of the community involved to record something for us. You know, it's their track that they've recorded, which is a nice little sort of icing on the cake. Getting some guests on. Variation of it. Again, I'd be amazed if some of this isn't already part and parcel of how you work anyway. If contributors are coming on, guests are coming on, explain to them, you're coming onto this podcast, potentially everybody in the world could hear it, so just bear that in mind. And what we want to do, we want to influence policy. Or we just want to tell people how good we are. We just want to give people a glimpse behind the curtain of our day-to-day practice. Yeah, tell them what it's going to be used for. They have to be, sorry, the numbering of that is all out, apologies for that. It has to be voluntary. You can't say, if you come on our podcast, we'll let you go on the trip. we'll give you that place on the course if you come on the podcast. That's not voluntary consent. They have to be able to understand the implications of coming on the podcast. Well, if you are coming on, again, maybe this hints at a couple of the comments in the chat. You're going to be coming on to talk about your experience of racism. Yeah. You may get some stick in the comments underneath. Now, I can turn the comments off. We can maybe not post the episode to social media in this instance, but you bear in mind, hey, listen, I deal with that every day. So yeah, no, it's fine. I got broad shoulders, but not everybody necessarily will be the same. So you get that comprehension and competence. And this is particularly important, particularly if people have maybe substance addictions issues. If it's involving children, do you need parental consent? If it's vulnerable adults that you're working with, just bear that in mind. Are they in a position to give their consent to come on as a guest and potentially say something that maybe they wouldn't say, I don't know, in the town square? And that's a very useful rule of thumb. Yeah. Would you say it, shout it in the street? If you wouldn't, you're probably not going to want to say it on my podcast. Yeah. So, and the one thing to sort of wrap around all of that is, whatever protocols that your organization has takes precedence. Whatever the laws of the land are, they take precedence. But these are more of an informal is not the right word, but these are additional to whatever those protocols and things are for you. Just very quickly, any questions on any of that? I wouldn't want that to scare people off, but at the same time, you need to be mindful that we work with people, we work in a social context, we work with some very difficult topics, and we work with some people with some very complex challenges as well. It's not a reason for not doing a podcast about some of the issues, but it's also something to bear in mind. How might you plan for a one-off series rather than ongoing? I think it's the same sort of process. You probably want to pay a little bit more attention to how you round it off. And what is your call to action? I'm a big fan of the call to action of individual episodes, those who've recorded with me. And it might just be like our Facebook page, but you create that active listenership rather than the passive one goes, oh, that was interesting, Hannah, but now I'm going to listen to some true crime. Oh, yeah, I'm going to go to the event. Oh, I'm going to download that report and take a look at it. That active listenership, I think, is important. You probably want to look at how you wrap that up. Yeah. Why is it? Explain why is it only a short series. You've probably done that at the start, actually. There's that kind of like closed bracket at the end of it, I think, is the way to do it. But there's probably several ways of doing that. Okay, conscious of time. Equipment. I've got by here one of these microphones plugged into the laptop. It's a Blue Yeti. Very, very simple. You can use portable recorders like a Zoom recorder. What I like about the Blue Yeti is that it just plugs straight in USB into my computer, and away I go. It has no memory, so on its own, it's useless out in the field. I would use my Zoom recorder if I wanted to record something in the field. Somebody said to me when I started, and I think this is a really useful golden rule for anybody, I think it still applies now, the better the microphone, the more it'll pick up, the more you'll need to edit, and you may not have the editing skills. If you buy a rubbish microphone, it's a rubbish microphone. If you buy a brilliant one, it's going to be a bit of a challenge for you, and I think that is a really useful golden rule. Okay, but you will need something to record. If it has internal memory, great, it's going to be a bit more portable. Take some spare batteries though, golden rule number 2. Otherwise, as I tend to do, here's my setup, this is how I record. The Yeti is down there, and it's got a little popping shield so it doesn't pick up the p sounds, or in Welsh the sounds as well can be a bit harsh on the ear. And it's very, very simple. It has a gain, a couple of different settings, and that's why I like it. That's the Blue Yeti. Can be found, tons of them on eBay, tons of them are found in those kind of high street sort of second-hand shops as well. That's what I'm going to do on recording. There's a time and a place for it. Most mics are fine for guests who are tuning in via the internet. There's the built-in laptop because they're very sophisticated now. But the editing is really, really important. And I love some of these tweets from years and years ago that passed me, come on my phone over the years. Yeah, give it an edit because it shows that you care about your product and it shows you care about your audience, your listeners, that you're editing this, that you're chopping out all the extraneous bits, yeah? Less can be more, okay, with these things. Most of the popular podcasts are popular because they have excellent audio, yeah? i.e., everyone has a very similar level of volume. Yeah? You can only up to a point, certainly over the internet, can you manage and be in control of that. There's no distracting background noise although that can sometimes add some authenticity. So, but you've got to bear in mind you may have to edit that out. Low, harsh, loud sounds, bangs, that kind of thing, hissing, the drone or the hum of traffic in the background, that can be a difficult one. That sense of ear fatigue when listening is really hard work. If you're speaking to somebody who is maybe English as a second language, it turns out that their microphone isn't particularly good. What you may want to do is to interject a lot with lots of questions. That just breaks up the flow a little bit. It's not changing what they say, but it's just maybe providing a little bit of up and down, a bit of variety to the listener. Because like I said, that ear fatigue is something that certainly turns me off podcasts. It was more a problem in the early days. And like I say, less is more. Keep the best bits out. I record something with my football one with someone regularly who will make a perfectly cogent point, and then we'll say, as I said, and then say it all again. Cut, that goes out because we heard it. Oh, there's not much of me on this episode, Russ. Well, it's because you have that habit of going, and it pulls out your foibles, this thing. If you are an ummer, I'm an ummer, you learn about it. You know what I mean? As I say, as it were, all of those foibles that come out, it really does expose those. I edit, as I said, in Audacity. It's free. You literally go to a Google search Audacity, download it, it goes on. If you're on a work computer, you may need to get permissions. There may also be a couple of patches that you need to download as well. If anybody finds that that's the case, your IT support should be able to help. If not, give me an email and I can point you in the right direction. If it's just your own personal device, it should be fine. It's open source, like I said, it's free. A large wiki community. How do I do so-and-so? Boomf. Ask the question and someone will answer it. What I like about it is, I'm old enough to remember the old tape recorders. Who else is with me? Remember the old tape recorders? It's the same sort of logos. It's the same icons. Yeah, it's built into our muscle memory. So I find it really, really simple. If you're first looking at this, it might look a little bit sophisticated. I use about 10% of its features. Okay. It's very similar to Windows, the drop down, the file, the edit view, which I quite like and find reassuring. You can control your mic and your volume, all those little things. These are the effects. Oh, this is where the magic happens. Oh, if anybody tells you they use all of these, they're lying. I think most people use about 8% of them, right? But this is where you can change the amplification. You can kind of dip stuff. You want to fade some music in at the back. That's where all the magic happens. And that's what people pay me to produce these things. That's where I spend a bit of my time. But that's the technical editing. The other aspect of editing is, and this is what a recording looks like, the other aspect is, what are the best bits? What am I keeping in? Has Harley made that point, made it cogently, made it succinctly? If he has, I don't need that little bit. That's gone. Or he gave me one example, illustration of the point. I don't need any more, or maybe one more. I don't need 9. Those two, because I'm respecting my listener. I don't want to go over time on the episode, as I might fear I'm doing on this recording. So Audacity is what to record in. And the best thing to do really is to just record and have a play around. Lastly, you export. An Audacity file is useless outside of Audacity. You export into what is usually an MP3 file or a WAV file. Again, a little bit of jargon, apologies for that. That is what you need to go upload into SoundCloud or wherever else you're going to host. Okay, so Clean Feed is what I use to record over the internet. Revolutionized things for me during COVID, and I pretty much have stuck with it. £15 a month, I think, for the paid tariff. There is a free tariff. You have fewer bells and whistles, and I think you have shorter recording times. But I could record a podcast with every single one of us in this room now via Clean Feed, and I would get an individual track for all of us, which would make my editing so much more easier, and therefore quicker, and therefore cheaper for the client if this was on a commercial basis. So that's something that's really, really important. Give it a look. There's a couple in the room who've probably used it with me. They can verify to how simple it is to use. I can mute people in it. They can mute themselves. Like I said, really, 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 really flexible. And that's why I tend to do the recording. If you're recording in face-to-face, which is great, it's a bit more in-depth, it's a little bit more personable, it's a bit more sociable. Just give some thought to where you want to record. Is it an echoey room? Are the acoustics any good? Noisy furniture is an absolute nightmare. Open a window, but then you get traffic, you get birdsong. Well, birdsong's not the worst thing to listen to, but traffic, ooh, geez. All of those sorts of things. Jewellery. People can be noisy. They have big bangly, jangly bracelets and necklaces and things like that. Who of you watching this now are leg shakers? Whose leg is going 10 to the dozen under the table? Yeah? You're a nuisance, leg shakers, when it comes to recording, because you don't know what's going on necessarily. You don't hear it, but it picks up under the microphone, particularly if you've got a good microphone. So, leg shakers can be a little bit of a pain, but location can help people feel at ease. Yeah, really, really key. If people feel at ease, they're going to give you better content. They're going to be better. They're going to feel more at home. They're going to give you their natural self, that authenticity that I think personally the best podcasts have. And like I said, the fidgeters, jewelry, mobile phones is a big one. But like I said, you could be in a community venue where actually a little bit of noise and interruption is fine. I mean, I remember doing an episode and the fire alarm went off. 40 minutes later, we got back in. It was still recording. We'd lost our flow. We just went, let's go with it. I edited it. I left in the fire alarm. I faded it right out, faded us back in and went, well, that was a bit of a nuisance. Made light of it. Why not? You're not going to bin it all off because the conversation was too good. So sometimes you've got to go with it because life gets in the way. Yeah.
Anna's asking, what about if you have to record people sitting around in groups?
Clip mics.
Where there's all that background noise you're talking about.
Yeah, so clip mics can be useful because it gets up close, but then you also get the rub of clothing. So anything kind of like tracksuity, fabricy, acrylic-y isn't great. Big facial hair now, big beards, they can be a nuisance. You can... I tend to find a mic, the Yeti, just in the middle of a little coffee table, and people sitting low down or maybe around a table, sitting up close, that's pretty good. But even then, you might have somebody with a big booming voice like this. You might have somebody who's a little bit slightly less tall. Practice, you're going with it. It's not an exact science, but you can be in control. What I would always say is if you're looking at your screen and you're seeing this isn't quite, and I'm not quite there, that's too quiet, why is it not picking them up? Just nuke it. Don't do that thing. And I've been there in the early days. We go, I'm sure it'll be okay in the end. It probably won't be. If you're not happy now, or you've got your doubts, you won't. You'll definitely have them at the end, and there's nothing you can do about it. So you've got to be controlled. And in my experience, most people want a benign dictator. They want to be told when to speak, what to do, when to this. Right, we're now recording. Go, keep doing it. And if I am recording in person, face to face, I give people a thumbs up. I kind of go, doing really well, brilliant. Yeah. So that's really, really, really important. The preparation, and there's some prompts there for you to read through, is really, really easy for people to help prepare. If they feel confident in what they're going to say, they're going to perform better. Yeah, and it's that kind of punchy. You ask them to introduce themselves. It's not the life story you want. You just want the, yeah. So be at ease with yourself. Helps others feel at ease. Yeah. If you look like you know what you're doing, even if you only look like you know what you're doing, your guests will go with it. They want to feel reassured. They want to know that you're in control. Okay, so projecting that is really, really important. I always spend quite a lot of time, and others, maybe people on this call may testify to that, spend quite a bit of time chatting because it just gets people into ease. Yeah, you know, you're getting the volume, you're getting ease. I'm orientating. How's the weather? We've all done that. Hannah, how's the weather with you? I probably asked you. Janine, how's the weather with you today? You know, at the moment, yeah. It's just getting people talking, and it's coming naturally. The things that people forget, write it down. Yeah. Our website is iacd.org.co. No, hang on. What's it? Write it down. Write your job title. The number of times people have forgotten their job title. All those sorts of things. Liaise beforehand. I've had people say, "Listen, can we do a little dry run?" Yeah, of course we can. If that's going to help you feel at ease, then great. And take some breaks. Reassure participants. Do that. Tell them they're doing great. All of that goes a long way to help them people feel at ease. And if they feel at ease, they will then perform better. They will give you better content, and it will be a better product content for the benefits of it. So there we go. Happy to take any questions. Sorry to overrun a little bit. There is a reminder of the IACD podcast, so get involved, give it a listen, give it a like, share the episodes at IACD_global. That's my community development podcast, also on SoundCloud, but on lots of other things. interested if anyone wants to be a guest sometime. Can't guarantee it'll be anytime soon, but drop me an email. And as I said, you'll be getting a copy of these slides in a moment, because there's a Padlet going out as well for you all. Reminder that there's a discount on the book, and that is available here. And I will bid you adieu. Diolch fawr iawn in Welsh. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Hopefully I've covered everybody's language in that little graphic there. If not, I apologise. And thank you to Anna Clark for helping oversee this. Thank you very much to Janine as well for hosting it and helping us steer it. Thank you to Jessica as well, who left us a bit earlier. And I wish you all the best with your podcasting efforts.
Thank you, Russell. Or as we say in South Africa, siabonga.